Medellín, Colombia. A city pulsing with fortune, fear, and secrets whispered in shadowed alleys. Above it all stands a man who seems untouchable, Pablo Escobar. The king of cocaine, a master of wealth and power, whose name commands both respect and terror. Yet behind the walls of his sprawling estate, amidst fountains, gardens, and laughter, he cannot sleep. Every shadow, every whisper, every step in the dark reminds him that control is never absolute, and even kings are haunted by fear. Tonight, we drift quietly into his world, the empire of influence, the labyrinth of loyalty, and the restless mind of a man who built too much to ever feel safe. Medellín, Colombia. The sun had just begun to stir over the Andes, spilling golden light across the sprawling city below. The streets were already humming with life, though it was a cautious kind of life, measured, alert, knowing that at any moment fortune or danger could tip the balance. Vendors opened stalls, bicycles rattled along cobblestone alleys, and the scent of fresh bread mingled with the earthy perfume of wet soil after an early morning drizzle. Yet even in this ordinary awakening, there was a pulse of tension, subtle and unyielding, threading through the city like an unseen heartbeat. Above it all, in a hilltop mansion that overlooked the city like a crown over a kingdom, he watched. Pablo Escobar, the man who had become a legend in his own lifetime, stood on the balcony with a glass of warm coffee in hand. His eyes traced the movements below, a courier weaving carefully through the market square, a motorbike slicing past a delivery truck, a stray dog darting between puddles. Every motion carried meaning. Every sound could signal opportunity or threat. He did not speak. He had no need. The quiet was enough. The city spoke for him, whispered to him, warned him. Even the birds seemed cautious this morning, their wings slicing the sky in measured arcs. Escobar had built an empire that reached across continents, touching currencies, borders, and even governments, yet here, standing above the sprawling labyrinth of Medellín, he felt the persistent tremor of unease. It was not the enemy he feared. Not the police, nor rival cartels, nor even the whispers of betrayal from those closest to him. He feared the silence, the moments when the world was still, and he could hear his own thoughts. He took a slow sip of coffee, the warmth barely cutting through the tension in his chest. He was a man who had spent his life carving power from shadows, who had erected towers of influence as others built homes, yet no tower could shield him from the quiet. No amount of money, of gunmen, of fortified walls, could buy the peace he craved but never found. The paradox of his existence was simple yet cruel. The more he controlled, the less control he had over himself. Inside the mansion, the morning rituals began. His children stirred in rooms filled with the gentle light of filtered sun, and somewhere, a parrot squawked as if rehearsing the day's news. The sound should have been comforting, a reminder of life's simplicity, but Escobar felt a twinge of irritation. Life was loud. Life was messy. Life was unpredictable. And unpredictability was a currency he had never learned to spend freely. Yet he moved through it with precision. He descended the stairs, boots clicking against polished wood, passing rooms lined with books, photographs, and mementos that told stories of both triumph and tragedy. A small television flickered silently in the corner, news anchors reporting on events that seemed distant, almost irrelevant compared to the immediacy of his concerns. He ignored it as he always did. Reality was here, in this house, in these walls, in the measured rhythm of servants, guards, and children alike. He stepped into the courtyard, where the sun now fully bathed the gardens in gold. Exotic birds strutted across the manicured lawns, and the faint aroma of blooming flowers mixed with the earthy scent of the morning. Escobar breathed it in deeply, seeking calm, yet his chest tightened. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every smile could mask betrayal. Trust, he had learned, was a luxury he could rarely afford. And yet he cared. Perhaps too deeply. His empire was vast, but within these walls he had built small sanctuaries, for his children, for the animals, for the poor who came seeking aid. A hospital here, a school there, a prison for himself constructed on a whim. These were gestures of power, yes, but also of vulnerability. In extending care he exposed himself. In seeking to shield others, he revealed the fragility of his own soul. The guards positioned at the perimeters of the estate moved with silent coordination, scanning the surroundings with eyes sharpened by years of vigilance. Escobar observed them not as a master watching servants, but as a man watching pieces on a chessboard. Every movement mattered. Every glance could contain information. Paranoia was a companion he welcomed yet despised, a twin that reminded him of mortality even as he danced on the edge of immortality in the eyes of Medellín's citizens. He wandered into the small library, its walls lined with leather-bound volumes, many in Spanish, some in English, recounting histories of conquest, of ambition, of men who had sought power and failed. He fingered the spines as if touching history could lend him the insight to navigate the present. Perhaps it did for a moment. Perhaps the stories whispered lessons he had not yet learned. But only for a moment. Soon the restlessness returned, like a tide refusing to ebb. Escobar knew he would not remain in one place today for long. He had learned over the years that routine was vulnerability. Patterns invited danger. Repetition was a trap. Even his children's laughter, sweet and innocent, was a reminder that the world outside these walls could strike at any moment. He forced a small smile, more for the comfort of appearances than for genuine joy, and returned to the balcony, coffee in hand once more. From this vantage point, he watched Medellín breathe, watched the market open, watched the early sun cast shadows across the uneven streets. He noted the rhythm, the patterns, the possibilities. He listened for the quiet that might indicate a threat, for the slightest shift in the ordinary hum of the city. And in this careful observation he felt both omnipotent and fragile, a contradiction that defined every moment of his waking life. Even here, even above it all, Escobar knew that the world demanded vigilance. Sleep, fleeting and unreliable, was a luxury he could seldom afford. He could build walls, amass fortune, command loyalty, but none of it could still the trembling in his chest when the wind shifted, when the distant sound of a car horn carried a hint of danger, when a shadow moved where none should be. And yet he remained. He ruled not just with force but with attention, with strategy, with an understanding of human nature that few could rival. He was feared, yes, but more importantly he was understood by few and understood incorrectly by even fewer. In this city that pulsed with both fear and fortune, he was the axis around which the world turned, yet he was also a man perpetually unmoored, adrift in his own empire. He took a final sip of coffee, letting the warmth fill him briefly before it was swallowed by the weight of anticipation. The day would begin. Meetings, transactions, decisions that could alter the course of thousands' lives. And through it all, the quiet hum of unease would persist, a constant companion reminding him that even kings are not immune to fear. As the city stirred fully to life below, Escobar lingered a moment longer on the balcony, letting the sun warm his face, letting the birds' squawks fill the air, letting the distant cries and chatter form a symphony of the ordinary. It was a momentary reprieve, a fragile pause before the storm of the day, before the world demanded his attention once more. And in that pause he remembered something that perhaps every powerful man knows in secret, that even at the height of dominion, control is never complete, and peace is always borrowed, never owned. Medellín had awakened. And so had the king, watching, listening, breathing, always vigilant. The morning sun had climbed higher, washing the hilltop mansion in soft, golden light. The city below buzzed with life, a thousand small dramas unfolding simultaneously, yet from this vantage point, everything appeared almost serene. For Escobar, serenity was an illusion, one he pursued meticulously but never truly grasped. Every corner of the sprawling estate, every meticulously trimmed hedge, every exotic bird and lush plant carried both comfort and risk. He wandered along the marble pathways of the courtyard, boots tapping softly, careful not to disturb the delicate balance he maintained. The flowers, bright and fragrant, reminded him of the fragility of life. One wrong move, one overlooked detail, and chaos could seep into even the most controlled environment. His eyes flicked to the parrot perched on a gilded stand, its colorful feathers ruffling in the gentle morning breeze. Even the bird seemed vigilant, turning its head sharply as if listening for the distant pulse of the city. Inside the mansion, the halls stretched like corridors of a palace. Rooms were filled with books, art, photographs, and relics collected over decades, each telling a story of conquest, ambition, and survival. Escobar ran his fingers along the spines of leather-bound volumes, feeling the weight of history in his hands. There were texts on military strategy, economics, and law, biographies of emperors, generals, and visionaries. He had read many of them countless times, but each revisit offered subtle insights. Each story reminded him that power was never permanent and that vulnerability often hid behind the most imposing facades. In the main hall, servants moved with quiet efficiency, arranging breakfast, polishing silverware, and attending to the myriad details that made a home appear effortless. Escobar watched them, his mind cataloging movements, noting subtle shifts in posture, in gaze, in expression. Trust was scarce, even among those who had served him faithfully for years. He reminded himself constantly, Loyalty was a currency, and like any currency, it could be spent or stolen. The children's laughter echoed faintly from the upper floors. Their voices, light and free, were a stark contrast to the weight pressing on Escobar's chest. He paused in the hall, closed his eyes, and let the sound wash over him. Moments like these were rare, delicate, and fleeting. He cherished them not because they could offer peace, but because they reminded him why he fought so relentlessly. Each decision, each calculated risk, was ultimately for them. His family, his legacy, the fragile threads of innocence that persisted amid the shadows of his empire. Yet even here, in the heart of his fortress, the world intruded. A car horn blared from the streets below. A courier delayed his delivery. A guard's gaze lingered too long on a photograph. These were small, almost trivial occurrences, but to Escobar they were like ripples in a pond, each one carrying the potential to disturb the delicate balance he maintained. Paranoia was not just a companion, it was a necessity, a lens through which he filtered every sensation, every movement, every breath. He stepped into the private study, a room reserved for solitude and strategy. Maps of Medellín and the surrounding regions covered the walls, marked with pins, notes, and coded symbols. Red lines traced routes, green pins indicated allies, and black dots signaled potential threats. He moved among them with precision, adjusting, reassigning, contemplating. This was his chessboard, and every person, every street, every shipment was a piece. Yet even the most calculated move could be undone by chance or betrayal. Outside, the gardens were alive with color and motion. Birds fluttered between trees, butterflies traced invisible paths over flowerbeds, and the fountains whispered a soft, rhythmic song. Escobar walked among them, occasionally pausing to straighten a bent stem, to adjust a stone, to smooth the path where a stray leaf had settled. These small acts were rituals, grounding him, reminding him that control, even over something as simple as a garden, was attainable, even if only partially. A sudden movement caught his eye, a man adjusting a window latch on the far side of the estate. Escobar's hand brushed against the pistol at his hip, not with intention but instinct. Every shadow, every flicker of motion could hide danger. The man's face, familiar and trusted, reassured him only marginally. Years of experience had taught Escobar that familiarity could be deceptive. The most loyal servant could harbor doubts, the most obedient ally could be swayed. The fine line between trust and vigilance was one he walked every day. In the dining room, breakfast awaited: eggs, fresh fruit, coffee, and pastries arranged meticulously on fine china. He took his seat, observing the table, the servants, and the subtle patterns of movement. He ate slowly, deliberately, savoring the flavors but also listening, noting, cataloging. Each clink of a spoon, each creak of the floorboards, each distant murmur from the city below was recorded in his mind, a part of the symphony of control he conducted. Escobar's thoughts wandered to the hospitals he had funded, the schools he had built, the lives he had touched through acts of charity. These were paradoxes of power. In giving he gained influence, in protecting he exposed vulnerability. Each act was both strategic and sincere, a blend of pragmatism and genuine care. Yet even these gestures could not shield him from the creeping unease that had become a constant companion. To wield great power was to accept great fragility. To command respect was to invite resentment. By late morning, Escobar moved through the estate, checking on workers repairing fences, ensuring security cameras were operational, and overseeing deliveries of supplies. His presence alone was both reassurance and warning. He inspired loyalty, yes, but also caution. Even the guards, seasoned men who had faced threats from rival cartels and law enforcement alike, understood the weight of his gaze, the subtle authority it conveyed. And yet, despite the meticulous order, the sprawling gardens, and the fortress-like walls, a small unease gnawed at him. There was always an element beyond control. A courier delayed by traffic, a rival plotting in shadows, a whisper of betrayal carried on the wind. Each day, each hour, each minute demanded attention, observation, and calculation. Escobar was both king and prisoner, ruler of vast territories and yet perpetually constrained by the fragility of human loyalty and the unpredictability of circumstance. He returned to the balcony, the sun now high, casting long, defined shadows across the estate. The city below shimmered with activity, a tapestry of commerce, life, and subtle danger. Escobar leaned against the railing, eyes scanning, absorbing, calculating. The paradox of his empire was clear. He had built a world of immense power and beauty, yet he was haunted not by enemies in the streets, but by the silent, unyielding awareness of vulnerability within his own walls. Time passed almost imperceptibly. The children's laughter echoed again, mingling with the hum of the city. Birds called to each other, fountains whispered, and the estate pulsed with life. And yet the unease lingered. It was a reminder that no fortress, no fortune, no army could grant true peace. The king of Medellín could command empires, influence governments, and inspire fear and admiration alike, but he could not command tranquility. As the morning gave way to midday, Escobar's gaze lingered on the horizon, contemplating the delicate balance he maintained. He understood, more acutely than most, that power was a fragile construct and life, even in its most opulent form, was unpredictable. And in that understanding lay both the thrill and the burden of being the most powerful man in Medellín. He turned from the balcony, walking back into the interior of the mansion, each step deliberate, measured. The day had only begun, and with it came decisions, movements, risks, and rewards. And through it all, the quiet awareness persisted. Even kings cannot escape the shadows that follow them, nor the restless pulse of their own hearts. In the stillness between actions, in the space between decisions, Pablo Escobar existed fully, not merely as a legend, not merely as a ruler, but as a man navigating the intricate, perilous, and beautiful empire he had created. And as he moved through the rooms of his home, observing, listening, calculating, he knew that the truest test of power was not in conquest, but in sustaining it, day by day, breath by breath, always vigilant, always awake. The day in Medellín unfolded with its usual rhythm, the streets alive with chatter, engines humming, footsteps weaving across cobbled lanes. From his hilltop vantage, Pablo Escobar observed it all, not as a casual witness, but as a man absorbing the city's pulse, reading its subtle signals like a map etched into the air itself. Every movement, every sound, every gesture carried significance, some trivial, some vital. To the untrained eye, Medellín was a city bustling with routine. To Escobar, it was a living, breathing organism, full of currents that could lift or drown a man without warning. Inside the mansion, his day began in earnest. The early morning calm had given way to a meticulous schedule, orchestrated with the precision of a maestro conducting a symphony. Meetings with trusted lieutenants, careful inspections of shipments, calculations regarding finance, arms, and influence, each element weighed, measured, and considered. Escobar had learned long ago that the true price of control was vigilance without pause, attention without respite, and trust without certainty. He descended the main staircase, polished wood underfoot, the echo of his boots swallowed by the vastness of the interior. Servants moved with quiet competence, tending to tasks that seemed mundane but were essential. In this orchestrated environment he could control every detail, every flower in the garden, every corner of the estate, every aspect of his immediate world. Yet even in this carefully maintained microcosm, a gnawing unease lingered. Outside the estate, the city's rhythm provided a backdrop of perpetual motion. Couriers navigated the traffic with practiced skill, carrying messages, packages, and goods, some innocuous, some of vital importance. Escobar's eyes followed the routes, the timing, the expressions of those carrying them. A delayed delivery, a nervous glance, a sudden hesitation, each was a potential crack in the structure he had spent decades building. The empire he controlled was immense, but he had come to understand that size and power were fragile illusions when the integrity of people remained uncertain. By mid-morning, Escobar convened a private meeting with several of his lieutenants. The room, lined with maps and charts detailing trade routes, security positions, and personnel, seemed almost sacred, a space where strategy and reality converged. He spoke sparingly, listening more than directing, allowing information to surface naturally. His mind catalogued every word, gesture, hesitation, and glance. Even among those most loyal, suspicion could exist, subtle and invisible. He had learned that the true threat was rarely from outside but from within. He noted the subtle signals, a finger tapping too quickly on the table, eyes darting for approval, a slight stiffening of posture. Each was a clue, a thread to follow. Paranoia had become a second skin, protective and suffocating at once. Escobar understood the delicate balance of fear and loyalty, the way influence could inspire obedience or resentment, the way power could be both armor and cage. In controlling others he risked his own stability. In asserting dominance he exposed vulnerability. A messenger arrived, breathless, delivering news of a delayed shipment and an unexpected inspection by authorities in a neighboring region. Escobar's mind raced, cataloging potential consequences, calculating contingencies. Every decision carried weight, not merely for the shipment itself but for the perceptions of allies, rivals, and the broader world. A single misstep could ripple outward, undermining trust, provoking conflict, or exposing weakness. The cost of control was constant vigilance, and the awareness that absolute control was unattainable. He excused himself from the meeting, retreating to the library where sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting patterned shadows across shelves lined with history and strategy books. He traced his fingers along the spines, absorbing lessons of ambition, conquest, and failure. Past rulers had faltered not through lack of power, but through misjudgment, miscommunication, and misplaced trust. Escobar reflected on each story, drawing parallels, extracting guidance, yet always aware that history offered lessons but not guarantees. Even as he consulted maps and charts, his mind wandered to the streets below, to the lives entwined with his own decisions. A family might lose their home, a courier might vanish, an ally might betray, and all could unfold within hours. The weight of such responsibility pressed upon him, not as a concept, but as a visceral sensation in his chest. Control came at a cost, the constant hum of tension, the awareness that no matter how far-reaching his empire, no fortress could fully shield him from uncertainty. By afternoon, Escobar moved through the estate inspecting guards, weapons, and logistics personally. Each interaction was calculated. A word here, a nod there, a subtle observation. Loyalty could be reinforced or undermined in moments so brief they might seem trivial to an outsider. Yet each moment was essential. To lead was to watch, to understand, to anticipate, and to correct before small cracks widened into dangerous fissures. In a private moment he walked the gardens alone. The flowers glowed under the sun, vibrant and serene, yet he felt no calm. Even in beauty he detected imperfection, potential vulnerability. Each carefully pruned hedge, each fountain's flow, each stone path reminded him that order was fragile, that control demanded constant attention, that peace was a temporary state borrowed from an uncertain universe. The afternoon brought visitors, trusted associates arriving with reports and proposals. Escobar listened, questioned, observed. Even in familiar company, subtle cues could betray intentions. He noted hand tremors, hesitation in speech, flickers of eye contact. The mind was the battlefield, and insight was both shield and weapon. Control required mastery over circumstance, over perception, over people, but never over the uncertainties that could intrude at any moment. Evening approached, and the mansion's shadows stretched long and deliberate. Escobar observed them with a practiced eye, aware of how darkness both concealed and revealed. A guard adjusting a lamp, a servant closing a window, a cat slipping silently between shadows. All actions were catalogued, processed, and interpreted. He was attuned to the smallest deviations, knowing that subtle signs often preceded significant events. As night descended, the city below glowed with lights, a tapestry of commerce, danger, and life. Escobar returned to the balcony, a glass of wine in hand, surveying the empire he had built. The control he wielded was immense, yet every decision reminded him of its impermanence. Even kings were subject to chance, to betrayal, to unforeseen variables. Absolute power was a mirage. Mastery over perception and influence was the closest reality could offer. In the quiet of the night, with Medellín alive yet distant, Escobar reflected on the paradox that defined him. A man of immense influence, feared and respected, yet perpetually shadowed by uncertainty. He could command men, dictate commerce, shape a city's flow, but he could not command certainty. He could build hospitals and prisons, schools and estates, but he could not build immunity against betrayal or misfortune. The sun set, and the estate filled with long shadows, the gardens whispering with the movement of animals and the soft murmur of wind through trees. Escobar lingered on the balcony, absorbing the symphony of sounds, the interplay of light and darkness, the delicate balance of power and vulnerability. He understood, more clearly than most, that control was both a gift and a burden, and that vigilance, constant, unyielding, was the true currency of kings. As the city below settled into the rhythms of night, and the distant hum of Medellín faded into quieter tones, Escobar allowed himself a moment of reflection. He had mastered many things: strategy, influence, fear, loyalty. Yet he had not mastered peace. He could shape the world outside but not the restless tides within. And perhaps he thought that was the price of control, the constant negotiation between power and vulnerability, between empire and self, between fear and the fleeting glimpses of calm that teased him just out of reach. He finally retreated indoors, the mansion's walls embracing him in their familiar security, yet unable to shield him entirely from the awareness that control was always temporary, that power was always fragile, and that the price of being king was eternal vigilance, thoughtfulness, and the endless, quiet reckoning with uncertainty. The mansion was quiet now, though the city of Medellín pulsed faintly in the distance, a heartbeat he could sense from his hilltop vantage. Pablo Escobar moved through the corridors, each step deliberate, each glance measured, a king navigating the dual realities of empire and vulnerability. Outside, sunlight filtered through the treetops, casting dappled patterns on the marble floors, shadows dancing like reminders of both presence and absence. In this interplay of light and dark, Escobar saw the reflection of his own life. Moments of brilliance intertwined with shadows of uncertainty, acts of benevolence shadowed by deeds of violence. He paused at a window overlooking the gardens. The fountains sparkled as if aware of their own beauty, birds moved among the flowering trees, and a cat slinked silently across the stone path. The scene could have been idyllic, peaceful, a portrait of serenity. And yet, in his chest, a restlessness persisted. It was the constant companion of men who wielded great power, a paradox where control and fear coexisted, where generosity and brutality were two sides of the same coin. Inside the mansion, children's laughter echoed faintly from the upper floors. He smiled briefly, the gesture fleeting, almost imperceptible. These moments reminded him why he maintained the empire he had built. Protection, provision, and legacy, the trifecta that drove every decision, every risk, every action. Yet even as he moved among these sanctuaries of innocence, he remained acutely aware of the impermanence of it all. A single misstep, a betrayal, a sudden eruption of violence, and these moments could vanish in an instant. He descended to the main hall, boots clicking softly on polished marble. The guards were stationed strategically, eyes sharp, hands resting lightly on weapons. Their presence, meant to provide security, also reinforced the duality of his existence. He was a man of immense influence, feared across continents, yet perpetually reliant on the vigilance of others. Power, he knew, was a fragile equilibrium. Too much trust could invite betrayal, too much suspicion could alienate allies. The paradox of kingship, he thought, was the constant negotiation between dominance and dependence. In the study, maps and documents covered every surface. Routes for shipments, territories for oversight, lists of allies and potential threats. Escobar moved among them with practiced ease, yet every decision carried the weight of consequence. He traced a finger along the path of a recent shipment, imagining all the variables: delays, inspections, ambushes, human error. Each calculation was essential, yet each also underscored the impossibility of total control. The more he sought to dominate his environment, the more he became acutely aware of its fragility. Later he walked to the gardens. The vibrant colors of flowers, the soft rustle of leaves, and the faint song of birds should have offered solace, but they only served to remind him of what could be lost. Beauty, like power, was transient. He adjusted a stone in the path, pruned a bent branch, rearranged a fallen flower. Each act of control over this small world gave him a fleeting sense of mastery, yet it could not extend to the vast, chaotic city below. The empire he built was immense, but it was built atop the unpredictability of human behavior. One betrayal, one error, and all the order he created could unravel. A messenger approached quietly, delivering a letter regarding a dispute between two lieutenants over territory. Escobar read it carefully, noting the language, the tone, the subtleties of phrasing. Disputes like these were microcosms of his empire, power, loyalty, and fear intersecting in unpredictable ways. He could enforce order with threats, with persuasion, with demonstration of force, but each intervention risked alienating, inspiring resentment, or even provoking rebellion. The paradox was clear. He could assert dominance, yet every assertion could sow seeds of vulnerability. In the evening, Escobar returned to the mansion's library. Light from the setting sun filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows that stretched across shelves lined with books. He ran his fingers along the spines, absorbing the wisdom of men who had risen and fallen, who had conquered and lost. History, he realized, was both a guide and a warning. Each story of success was shadowed by tales of hubris, miscalculation, and betrayal. Power was intoxicating, but it was never absolute. And yet, he could not relinquish it, for the very notion of surrender was incompatible with his identity. Dinner was a subdued affair, taken alone, the table meticulously arranged but devoid of companions. The city lights below began to flicker on, casting a faint glow through the windows. Escobar sipped wine slowly, letting the taste linger as his mind catalogued the events of the day, contemplated potential threats, and considered the fragility of relationships. Even those closest to him, family, allies, loyal servants, were part of the complex calculus of control. Trust was measured, conditional, never absolute. Night fell fully, and the mansion was enveloped in a gentle darkness. Escobar moved from room to room, observing, listening, assessing. A guard adjusted the locks on a side door, footsteps muffled by thick rugs. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and distant city sounds carried faintly through the night. Every sound, every movement was a signal, a piece of information to be processed and acted upon if necessary. The paradox of his life was evident. Surrounded by abundance, guarded by loyal men, cushioned by wealth and power, yet he remained acutely aware of vulnerability, acutely conscious of the fragility of control. Escobar paused at the balcony, the moon casting silver light over the gardens. He watched the fountains shimmer, the shadows of trees stretch across paths, the animals move with quiet grace. Here was beauty, serenity, life itself, and yet, within him, the restlessness persisted. The more he controlled, the more he was reminded of what he could not control. The more power he wielded, the more conscious he became of its limits. The empire he created was immense, yet every brick, every path, every loyal guard was a potential weakness in disguise. The night deepened and Escobar's thoughts turned inward. He reflected on the lives affected by his decisions, the alliances maintained through fear and favor, the constant tension between benevolence and brutality. He understood that each act, whether of kindness or coercion, was a double-edged sword, a tool to maintain order and a reminder of how easily order could be lost. The paradox of being king was to wield immense influence while acknowledging the fragility inherent in that influence, to assert dominance while understanding the constant risk of collapse. Finally, he retreated indoors, walking slowly through the dimly lit corridors. Servants moved quietly, shadows of motion barely detectable. Escobar allowed himself a brief pause, listening to the subtle sounds of the mansion, the distant pulse of Medellín, the whisper of wind through the trees. Even in these moments of seeming solitude, he remained vigilant. Control, he realized, was never complete. Peace was fleeting. And the paradox of his life, the coexistence of power and vulnerability, of benevolence and brutality, of fear and influence, was an ever-present companion shaping every breath, every decision, every heartbeat. As he prepared for the night, Escobar understood the essence of his existence. To rule was to balance extremes, to maintain harmony in chaos, to navigate the ever-shifting currents of loyalty and threat. The life of a king was paradoxical indeed, and he had learned to walk its narrow edge with deliberate care. And though sleep would come eventually, it would never be complete, for a man who commanded an empire so vast could never entirely release the vigilance that was both his gift and his curse. The sun had long disappeared beyond the horizon, leaving Medellín bathed in the muted glow of streetlights and distant neon signs. Shadows stretched across the city, folding alleys and plazas into dark, silent forms that could conceal both wonder and threat. From his hilltop mansion, Pablo Escobar watched the twilight transform the familiar streets into a labyrinth of possibility and peril. Each flicker of light, each rustle of leaves, each distant engine hum was recorded in his mind, catalogued and interpreted for meaning. The evening air was thick, carrying the scent of damp earth and the faint aroma of cooking fires from the homes below. Even in such familiar surroundings, he felt a tightness in his chest, a whisper of unease that had grown stronger over the years. Nights were never simple. They were a delicate dance between vigilance and exhaustion, between awareness and the rare, fleeting need for rest. Sleep, when it came at all, was partial, fractured, always interrupted by the persistent hum of fear. He walked the halls of his mansion slowly, boots clicking against polished marble, echoing softly into the vast spaces. Guards moved with silent efficiency, their eyes sharp, hands resting lightly on weapons. Escobar's own hand brushed against the grip of his pistol, a motion almost instinctive, a reminder that danger was never fully absent. Even in the sanctuary of walls he had built with wealth, influence, and power, vulnerability lingered. Every shadow could hide an enemy, every sound could signal betrayal, every familiar face could conceal deception. He paused at a window, eyes tracing the streets below, absorbing every detail. Couriers navigated narrow lanes, vehicles passed in cautious arcs, families gathered in modest homes. The city moved as always, its rhythm predictable yet unpredictable, ordinary yet filled with potential for disruption. Escobar's mind catalogued it all, noting subtle deviations from routine, slight hesitations in movement, the unexpected flicker of light. In these small anomalies he searched for clues, threats, opportunities. His paranoia was not irrational, it was refined, a trained vigilance honed by years of experience, by the constant negotiation with risk that defined his empire. The mansion itself seemed alive in the night. Windows reflected moonlight across polished floors, furniture cast long shadows, and the faint whisper of the wind through the trees created a symphony of sound that could be comforting or foreboding depending on perception. Escobar walked past the library, its leather-bound volumes darkened by evening, their presence a reminder of knowledge, strategy, and the lessons of men who had risen and fallen before him. History was always watching, he thought. It taught, but it did not protect. A sudden movement caught his attention, a guard shifting near the edge of the garden, a cat slipping silently between shadows, a branch bending in the wind. Each motion demanded analysis, each sound a possible signal. He listened closely, every nerve alert, every sense tuned to detect the slightest anomaly. Even the ordinary could conceal threat, and Escobar had learned to expect the extraordinary to emerge from the ordinary without warning. He descended to the lower floors, walking past servants attending to tasks with quiet efficiency. Their movements were subtle, deliberate, rehearsed, yet each carried potential meaning. He noted glances that lingered slightly too long, subtle changes in posture, tiny hesitations in movement. Paranoia, cultivated and constant, sharpened perception and extended his ability to respond, but it also made rest a rare commodity. The mind, even when body demanded sleep, remained active, parsing potential risks, anticipating dangers, and strategizing responses. In the dining hall, a light supper awaited him. He ate slowly, deliberately, savoring the flavors while his mind catalogued the day's events and projected possible scenarios for the night. Each morsel, each sip, was accompanied by observation. The way shadows stretched across the room, the glint of moonlight on polished surfaces, the subtle hum of electronics, the distant echoes from the city below. Control was in the details, and attention to detail was a constant obligation. Night deepened, and Escobar moved through the mansion with heightened awareness. Every door, every window, every corridor was monitored, not merely by his guards, but by his own acute perception. The slightest irregularity could indicate threat. A visitor at an unexpected hour, an unusual movement in the gardens, a courier delayed in returning from the city. He catalogued each possibility, weighing likelihoods, anticipating consequences. The empire he commanded demanded perpetual vigilance, and night was when the consequences of inattention were most likely to manifest. Outside, the gardens shimmered in moonlight. Fountains sparkled, trees cast intricate shadows, and exotic birds rested quietly in the branches. Escobar walked among them, noting every sound, every flicker of motion. Even the peacefulness of the scene carried potential for danger. Serenity, he had learned, could mask the smallest betrayal. He adjusted a flower, shifted a stone path, straightened a lantern. Small acts of control brought fleeting comfort but reminded him always that the wider world remained uncontrollable, unpredictable, and potentially lethal. A distant noise, a car braking sharply, a dog barking, a voice carried on the wind, sent a ripple of tension through him. He paused, listening, scanning, analyzing. Each alertness was a test, each precaution a necessary exercise in survival. Sleep, if it arrived at all, would be shallow, punctuated by dreams of failure, of betrayal, of consequences he could neither foresee nor prevent. The mind of a king never truly rests, for vigilance is the price of survival, and control, though desired, is never absolute. He moved back inside, retreating to the study where maps and documents awaited his scrutiny. Routes for shipments, territories for oversight, personnel lists, all required attention, adjustment, consideration. Each decision carried potential consequences not just for commerce but for life and death. The cost of control was heavy, measured not in gold or influence, but in constant mental exertion, in the refusal to allow the mind even a moment of reprieve. Hours passed in silent vigilance. Guards shifted positions, monitors glowed faintly, the city whispered below, and Escobar continued his patrols through the mansion. He observed, listened, calculated, imagined scenarios and prepared contingencies. Night for him was not a time of rest but a theater of awareness, a space where the vulnerabilities of empire became most apparent, and where the paradox of kingship, immense power paired with persistent fear, was laid bare. By the late hours the mansion had quieted. Servants rested, guards maintained positions, the city had settled into a gentler rhythm. Escobar lingered on the balcony, moonlight bathing his figure, eyes scanning, mind cataloging, heart vigilant. Even here, amidst luxury, amidst control, he could not escape the unease that defined him. The night was both sanctuary and threat, canvas and cage. And yet, in this tension there was clarity. Escobar understood the essence of his existence. That vigilance, awareness, and preparation were inseparable from the power he wielded. The price of control was perpetual alertness, the constant negotiation between calm and chaos, the unwavering acknowledgement that even the most fortified walls could not shield him from uncertainty. As the first hints of dawn began to pale the night sky, Escobar remained on the balcony, contemplating the hours past and the day to come. The city once again would awaken, and with it the cycle of observation, decision, and consequence would continue. Sleep might come eventually, fleeting and partial, yet the nights of unease had carved a rhythm into his life, one that would persist as long as he ruled, as long as he survived, as long as he was king. Night had draped itself over Medellín like a velvet cloak, soft and concealing, yet heavy with anticipation. From the hilltop mansion, Pablo Escobar observed the city below, now transformed under the muted glow of streetlights and scattered neon signs. Shadows pooled in alleys and corners, stretching and twisting in the faint breeze. To anyone else, these shadows might have appeared harmless, even inviting, but to Escobar each darkened contour held potential meaning, potential threat. The mansion was quiet except for the gentle creak of the old wooden floors beneath his boots. Escobar moved carefully, the faint rustle of his clothing amplified in the stillness. Guards patrolled with silent efficiency, their eyes trained, hands resting lightly on weapons. Every step, every shift in the air, every whisper of movement was catalogued in his mind. Even the walls seemed to speak, echoing past events, murmuring warnings of betrayal and danger. Escobar paused at a window overlooking the gardens. The fountains reflected moonlight in silvery patterns, rippling shadows across the stone paths. Birds rested silently in the branches of flowering trees, and a stray cat prowled near the edge of the hedges. These ordinary movements held attention for him, a subtle reminder that control was fragile. Even beauty could mask peril, and tranquility could conceal the whisper of an intruder. A sudden sound, a faint, deliberate footstep on the gravel path, made him stiffen. He turned sharply, eyes scanning, listening. The mansion's perimeter was well guarded, but the city below was unpredictable. Couriers, thieves, rival operatives, even the government, anyone could approach unseen. The sound repeated, soft and cautious, yet distinct enough to confirm his suspicion. Someone was moving through the darkness. Escobar's hand brushed the grip of his pistol, instinct overriding deliberation. His eyes flicked across the courtyard, noting the subtle shadows cast by trees and lanterns. He counted the seconds between movements, the pause, the slight shift of wind against foliage. Each micro-detail was essential. In this night, understanding the ordinary was crucial, for the ordinary could harbor extraordinary danger. The guards remained unaware, moving in their regular circuits. Escobar did not alert them. He did not need to. Detection was an art, a silent game of observation. He descended softly to the lower courtyard, steps measured, posture low. Every sound, every hint of motion was analyzed. The intruder's path, though faint, left clues. A scuff mark, a slight disturbance of leaves, the subtle bending of branches. Escobar catalogued it all, mapping the movement in his mind with a precision that only years of vigilance could cultivate. He paused near a side door, breath controlled, senses heightened. The night smelled of wet earth and blooming flowers, mixed with the faint scent of cooking fires from distant homes. It should have been calming, even pleasant. But for Escobar it carried tension. The city whispered potential threats in the language of the ordinary. Even a familiar face could be a harbinger of betrayal, and every familiar gesture could conceal deception. He was trained to perceive these nuances, and tonight, every subtle signal was magnified in his awareness. The sound of footsteps grew slightly closer, deliberate yet cautious. Escobar adjusted his stance, mind racing with possibilities. Who approached? A courier delayed? A rival testing defenses? An informant seeking to tip the scales? Each scenario demanded rapid assessment. If he acted too soon, he might reveal his own intentions. If too late, he might invite danger. The balance between action and observation was delicate, the night a theater of uncertainty. He moved through the shadows, silent, methodical, tracing the path of the intruder with heightened senses. The courtyard, with its fountains, flowerbeds, and stone paths, became a stage for a game he had played countless times, yet each iteration felt unique, critical, and perilous. The mansion's walls, though imposing, offered only partial security. Vigilance was required at every threshold. Even the smallest oversight could have dire consequences. Minutes passed in tense silence. The footsteps halted near the far edge of the property. Escobar's mind calculated possibilities, recalling previous incidents, anticipating the intruder's next move. The night held infinite variables: wind direction, faint sounds from the city, shadows cast by moonlight. Each factor could reveal or conceal threat. Each required attention. Each demanded calculation. A figure emerged briefly from the shadow of a tree, a courier, perhaps, delivering urgent news. Escobar's eyes narrowed, analyzing posture, gait, subtle cues of nervousness or intention. The figure froze, sensing eyes upon him. Time stretched, elongated by tension. Each second waited with the possibility of confrontation. Escobar stepped lightly into the open, projecting authority through presence alone. The figure flinched, then bowed slightly, a sign of acknowledgement or submission. Relief washed subtly over him, but vigilance did not fade. Every night brought such encounters, some mundane, some fraught with hidden risk. Each was a reminder of the delicate balance of his empire: power, loyalty, and the perpetual threat of disruption intertwined in a single thread, taut and unforgiving. Returning indoors, Escobar reflected on the nature of his vigilance. The night, a time when most sought rest, was for him a crucible of awareness, perception, and subtle decision-making. Sleep was fleeting, peace was borrowed, control was partial. The shadows of the dark revealed not only external threats but the internal architecture of fear, trust, and calculation that defined his life. He moved through the mansion's halls, observing shadows, listening to subtle noises, noting the faint hum of distant city life. Even in familiar territory, danger could emerge unexpectedly. A misplaced step, a hesitation, a sound out of rhythm could signify a cascade of consequences. His mind catalogued and anticipated, turning ordinary observations into a network of potential scenarios and outcomes. As the night deepened, Escobar paused on the balcony. The moon cast silver light across the gardens, fountains, and tree-lined pathways. The city below glimmered softly, a network of lives and stories, each potentially intersecting with his own. He contemplated the fragile threads of trust, the inevitability of betrayal, the constant presence of risk, and the paradox of being the most powerful man in Medellín while remaining vulnerable in his own stronghold. He let himself breathe, a slow, deliberate inhalation and exhalation. The night was alive, each sound, shadow, and motion a note in a symphony that only he fully understood. And in that moment he recognized the duality that defined him: a king who commanded empires and inspired fear, yet a man whose nights were consumed by vigilance, whose sleep was punctuated by unease, whose mind never fully rested. Even as the first hints of pre-dawn light began to pale the eastern sky, Escobar remained on the balcony, watching, listening, calculating. The city once again would awaken, and with it, the cycle of observation, decision, and consequence would resume. He understood that control was never complete, that vigilance was eternal, and that the night itself, with all its shadows and footsteps, was both a challenge and a teacher. In the quiet that remained before dawn, he accepted the paradox of his existence: that power and vulnerability were inseparable, that authority demanded awareness, that kings might rule vast domains yet remain prisoners of their own minds. And as the night slowly yielded to the light of a new day, Escobar allowed himself the smallest of comforts: the knowledge that for now he had navigated the darkness without faltering, and that his vigilance, though exhausting, had preserved the fragile balance of his empire for yet another night. The morning light filtered gently through the curtains, casting elongated patterns across the polished floors of the hilltop mansion. Pablo Escobar stirred from a brief, shallow sleep, the echoes of last night's vigilance still lingering in his mind. Sleep had been elusive as it always was, interrupted by dreams of betrayal, ambushes, and the fragile balance of his empire. Yet even in the restless half-light, there was a softness that no amount of paranoia could erase: the sound of his children stirring, the faint laughter of his family preparing for the day. He dressed quietly, boots echoing softly on the marble floors, careful not to disturb the rhythm of the household. Guards moved in measured patrols, servants attended to routine tasks, and the mansion seemed alive with subtle movement, a living organism of order and caution. Escobar paused at the top of the staircase, listening to the faint chatter from the dining room. His children were awake, curious, their voices light and unburdened by the weight of empire. The contrast was stark. Outside these walls, the city of Medellín thrummed with danger and opportunity, each alley and street a potential site of conflict or commerce. Inside, he bore the responsibility not just of power but of protection, of maintaining a fragile sanctuary amid chaos. Each day presented new challenges: rival cartels testing limits, government forces probing weaknesses, and the constant tension of loyalty among those he depended upon. And yet, within the sanctuary of family, Escobar found a grounding that even wealth and influence could not provide. He entered the dining room to find his children gathered around the table, eager for breakfast, their eyes bright with curiosity and innocence. His wife moved gracefully between them, arranging plates, offering gentle smiles, her presence a stabilizing force. Escobar allowed himself a small smile, savoring the normalcy of the scene. These moments, fleeting and delicate, reminded him why he had constructed the empire he commanded: for protection, for provision, for legacy. And yet even here the paradox persisted. His family was his anchor, yet their safety depended entirely on his vigilance, his decisions, his capacity to anticipate threats invisible to ordinary eyes. Every shipment delivered safely, every rival neutralized, every subtle negotiation maintained the illusion of security. But security was never guaranteed. Even within these walls, trust was measured, conditional, and fragile. As breakfast concluded, a messenger arrived with reports of a skirmish on the outskirts of the city, a conflict between loyal lieutenants and a rival faction encroaching on territory. Escobar read the report carefully, noting not just the facts but the subtleties of language, the potential motivations of those involved. Each action within his empire was layered: loyalty intertwined with fear, duty complicated by personal ambition. To respond effectively required foresight, precision, and an understanding of human behavior that few could match. He stood on the balcony, observing the gardens bathed in morning light, and contemplated the delicate interplay of authority and affection. Family demanded protection, yet the very acts of protection could invite danger. His wealth and influence, which allowed him to safeguard his loved ones, also painted targets on their backs. The greater the security he provided, the greater the incentive for enemies to challenge him. Paradox, he realized, was embedded in every gesture, every choice, every breath. Later he convened a private meeting with his closest advisors. The discussion was practical: territory disputes, shipment logistics, potential threats. But beneath it lay a constant awareness of trust. Who could be relied upon implicitly? Who harbored ambitions that might one day betray him? Every word, every hesitation, every fleeting glance was a potential clue. Escobar's mind catalogued, processed, and evaluated continuously, aware that the slightest misjudgment could ripple outward, imperiling both empire and family. Despite the vigilance required, he found moments to engage with his children. They played quietly in the gardens and he walked among them, a giant in their small world, simultaneously protector and distant ruler. Their laughter was both balm and reminder. They were vulnerable, dependent on him, yet blissfully unaware of the dangers encroaching on their lives. Each interaction carried dual significance, blending affection with strategy. He taught lessons in subtlety, caution, and observation, embedding skills that might one day serve them, whether in survival, in influence, or in maintaining the fragile equilibrium of legacy. The afternoon brought another series of subtle tests. A lieutenant approached with questions regarding division of resources, phrasing cautiously, aware of scrutiny. Escobar noted hesitation, body language, tone, the micro-movements that betrayed intention. He responded carefully, affirming loyalty where deserved, correcting potential errors without unnecessary confrontation. The balance was delicate: encouragement without indulgence, vigilance without suspicion, overwhelming trust. Family relied on him, allies depended on him, and each relationship was a strand in the intricate web he maintained with precision. By evening, shadows stretched across the estate, casting long, fluid shapes that shifted with the fading sun. Escobar moved through corridors, pausing at windows to observe the city below. The familiar sounds of Medellín at dusk, the distant traffic, occasional shouts, the faint clatter of carts, formed a symphony of life and latent threat. Here again the paradox asserted itself: a man capable of commanding empires yet dependent on vigilance to ensure his loved one's safety. Authority required constant attention. Neglect was perilous. He returned to the private library as night fell fully, the soft glow of lamps illuminating walls lined with books, documents, and photographs. He reflected on the paradox of loyalty: how fear could ensure obedience, yet how trust could inspire devotion more resilient than fear. Family offered love, yet their very existence demanded ceaseless vigilance. The lives of those he cherished depended on choices made in shadows, decisions balanced between risk and reward. The weight of such responsibility was both privilege and burden. As darkness settled, Escobar paused once more on the balcony. The gardens shimmered in moonlight, fountains whispered, the distant city glimmered faintly. Children slept within the mansion, their breaths steady, untroubled, unaware of the subtle calculations that ensured their safety. Even here, amidst comfort, privilege, and affection, the knowledge remained. Absolute control was impossible, vigilance eternal, and loyalty both priceless and fragile. He allowed himself a moment to breathe deeply, absorbing the cool night air, the soft murmurs of wind, the gentle glow of the moon. In this stillness, the paradox crystallized. Family was both anchor and responsibility, affection entwined with danger, love inseparable from vigilance. The life of a king demanded balancing these extremes, negotiating between protection and freedom, authority and intimacy, fear and devotion. And as he turned away from the balcony, moving toward the quiet corridors of the mansion, Escobar understood that this balance would never be fully resolved. It was a cycle of care and calculation, of attention and anticipation, of love intertwined with duty. The night would pass, threats would be evaluated, decisions executed, and the delicate equilibrium maintained, until the next day brought new challenges, new decisions, and the unending negotiation between family, loyalty, and empire. The day began with a deceptive stillness. Medellín lay beneath the early morning sun, streets winding lazily between colorful buildings, the distant mountains shrouded in mist. To the casual observer, it was a city of routine, markets opening, motorbikes weaving through alleys, children laughing in schoolyards. But to Pablo Escobar, every sound, every movement carried the potential for disruption, a subtle signal that could indicate loyalty, treachery, or danger. The quiet of the morning was never comforting. It was a canvas upon which shadows could move unseen. Inside his hilltop mansion, Escobar convened a meeting with his lieutenants. The room, lined with maps, charts, and photographs, radiated an aura of calculated authority. Each man present carried experience, influence, and ambition, and each harbored thoughts and desires that could serve or undermine him. As he listened, carefully parsing words and observing gestures, the subtle indicators of human intention were clear. Hesitation, shifting weight, fleeting glances. Trust was a currency he valued above gold, yet one that could vanish with a single misstep. A report arrived from a remote corner of the city. A minor shipment had been intercepted, apparently due to misinformation. Escobar's brow furrowed, not from anger alone but from recognition. This was no random error. The disruption suggested deliberate interference. A leak, a betrayal, a misalignment within his ranks. His mind catalogued possibilities. Which lieutenant had failed in oversight, which courier might have been compromised, which rival was testing defenses. Each scenario was considered, weighed, and measured against the risk it posed to both his empire and his family. The morning stretched into afternoon, and Escobar moved through the estate, inspecting guards, reviewing security protocols, and observing every detail of the environment. Each interaction was layered with meaning, a question, a gesture, a pause. One lieutenant's explanation seemed overly detailed, another's too casual. He listened, observing, calculating. Betrayal could wear many faces, obedience masking resentment, loyalty tainted with ambition. The weight of these possibilities pressed upon him, the duality of trust and suspicion shaping each step he took. In the private study, Escobar reviewed letters and communications intercepted from external contacts. Rival cartels, opportunistic officials, and even supposed allies were maneuvering, testing boundaries, probing weaknesses. Every word was scrutinized, every nuance analyzed. The subtle currents of betrayal were everywhere, flowing beneath the surface of ordinary interactions, and he, as ever, navigated them with a vigilance born of necessity. By late afternoon he received an urgent message. A courier had been delayed, his route compromised. Escobar's mind raced, connecting threads, anticipating consequences. Even the smallest disruption could cascade into larger, more dangerous events. He dispatched trusted aides to confirm facts, rearranged security measures, and updated his personal schedule to account for the uncertainty. The invisible chessboard of his empire demanded constant adaptation. A miscalculation could prove catastrophic. Even as he acted decisively, Escobar reflected on the nature of human loyalty. Fear and respect could enforce obedience temporarily, yet genuine allegiance required more than intimidation. Betrayal often arose not from hatred alone, but from ambition, desire, or opportunity. He understood this interplay intimately, navigating it daily, balancing correction with reassurance, vigilance with subtle reward. In this delicate equilibrium lay both power and vulnerability, authority and fragility. The evening brought another layer of complexity. A trusted lieutenant requested a private audience, ostensibly to discuss minor logistics. Escobar observed closely: posture, eye contact, inflection, timing. The conversation revealed a subtle undercurrent of dissent, veiled in politeness. Each carefully chosen word carried potential risk. Escobar's mind catalogued motivations, weighed options, considered contingencies. To confront too directly could alienate, to ignore could embolden. Strategy, subtlety, and psychological acuity were essential. As night fell, the mansion took on a different character. Shadows stretched across polished floors, fountains reflected silvery moonlight, and the soft hum of the city below created a low, constant resonance. Escobar walked slowly through the halls, listening for irregularities, observing behavior, scanning every detail. Even in familiar surroundings, betrayal could manifest in the smallest deviation. A hesitated glance, a shuffled foot, a tone slightly off in conversation. He paused on the balcony, overlooking gardens bathed in silver light. The fountains whispered, the leaves murmured, and the distant city glimmered faintly. Here the paradox of power was clear. Surrounded by loyal men, armed guards, and a fortress of wealth, he remained acutely aware of the fragility inherent in human relationships. Betrayal could erupt without warning, and vigilance was the only guarantee of survival. Escobar allowed himself a brief reflection. Loyalty was both priceless and precarious. Fear could ensure obedience, but respect, trust, and subtle incentives nurtured commitment that endured beyond coercion. The night, with all its shadows, revealed both the strength and the weakness of his empire. Every decision he made, every action he undertook, was a measure of control against an ever-present tide of uncertainty. Hours passed in silent observation. Escobar moved through the mansion, checking doors, reviewing guard positions, and observing subtle interactions among aides and staff. Each moment carried dual significance: practical in terms of security and strategy, psychological in terms of perception, influence, and potential threat. Betrayal was not always overt. It often crept in through omission, hesitation, or misdirection. Recognizing it required attention, patience, and the ability to interpret signals invisible to the untrained eye. By midnight he returned to the private study. The maps, documents, and notes glimmered in the dim light, each representing a fragment of control, a facet of influence, a node in the network of his empire. He reviewed them meticulously, connecting patterns, anticipating moves, and preparing responses. The subtle web of loyalty and deceit required constant adjustment, a delicate dance in which any misstep could have far-reaching consequences. Even in solitude, Escobar remained vigilant. The quiet was deceptive. Every creak, every shadow, every distant sound carried meaning. Footsteps in the night could signify nothing, or everything. The faint rustle of leaves outside a window, the shifting of a guard in a corridor, the pause in a courier's signal, each was a potential indicator, a test of perception, a challenge to authority. In this awareness lay both mastery and burden, the price of power and the cost of vigilance. As the night deepened, he allowed himself a rare moment to breathe, to reflect on the intricate dance of human loyalty and ambition that defined his life. Betrayal was inevitable, perhaps even natural. The question was how to detect it, manage it, and survive it without compromising the stability of the empire, or the safety of those he cherished. The shadows of betrayal were always present, weaving silently through the fabric of his days and nights, yet he remained resolute, methodical, and unyielding in his awareness. As the first hints of dawn tinged the horizon, Escobar remained on the balcony, surveying both the mansion and the city below. The night had passed without incident, yet the lessons remained clear. Vigilance was eternal, perception was survival, and trust, precious, delicate, and powerful, must always be tempered with awareness. Even kings, he thought, could be betrayed from within their own walls, and the shadows of deceit were never far, no matter how secure the fortress or loyal the lieutenants. And in that quiet pre-dawn moment, amidst the fountains, the gardens, and the distant glow of Medellín, Escobar understood the paradox of his life once again. The more he commanded, the more he needed to watch. The more loyalty he inspired, the more subtle the threats. The greater the empire, the heavier the price of its preservation. The night had tested him and he had prevailed, for now, but he knew as always that vigilance, insight, and strategic foresight would be demanded endlessly, in every hour, every day, every shadow. The afternoon sun had long faded, leaving the hilltop mansion cloaked in soft shadows that stretched across marble floors and manicured gardens. Pablo Escobar moved through the halls with the practiced ease of a man familiar with every corner, every corridor, every window. The estate, vast and fortified, was a testament to his power, a fortress designed to shield him from the unpredictable world below. Yet, despite walls, gates, and loyal guards, the weight of solitude pressed upon him as surely as any enemy's threat. Inside the mansion, rooms that once offered comfort now felt like cells. Bookshelves lined the walls, overflowing with volumes of history, strategy, and law. Artifacts collected from decades of travel and conquest adorned surfaces. Each object, while a reminder of achievement, also whispered of responsibility, consequence, and the unyielding demands of power. Even amid luxury, Escobar felt the isolation that came with commanding an empire, a silent prison of wealth, influence, and expectation. He paused in a hallway, listening to the faint murmur of the city below. Street vendors called, children laughed, distant engines hummed, yet their sounds seemed to emphasize his separation rather than connect him to the life of the city. The paradox was persistent. He had built walls of protection and comfort, but those same walls created boundaries that isolated him from ordinary human experiences. Authority and vigilance, it seemed, came with a price no treasure could alleviate. Escobar's mind drifted to the concept of control, the invisible architecture of power he had constructed throughout Medellín. Yet no empire, no matter how vast, could grant certainty. Trust remained conditional. Loyalty was a delicate balance maintained through fear, reward, and respect. One misstep, one lapse in judgment, could unravel months or years of careful orchestration. And in these moments of reflection, he felt acutely the weight of solitude that power inevitably demanded. He wandered into the library, a place both sanctuary and study, where maps covered walls and documents chronicled every detail of his operations. Here, in quiet observation, he contemplated the lives intertwined with his own, the allies whose loyalty was tested daily, the rivals plotting in shadows, the innocents whose fates were shaped by his choices. Each consideration reminded him of the fragile architecture of control, a structure maintained not by walls or wealth alone, but by continuous attention, calculation, and anticipation. Later, he moved to one of the private wings of the mansion, designed as a self-contained security area, a personal fortress within the fortress. The rooms were secure, monitored, and prepared for any conceivable threat, yet the very perfection of these measures accentuated the inescapable truth: safety was never absolute. Even within this controlled environment, vulnerability lingered, manifesting as doubt, concern, or the intangible unease that accompanied awareness of impermanence. Escobar paused at a window overlooking the distant city. The streets shimmered faintly under lamplight, but beyond the visible, the unknown stretched in every direction. A shadow among shadows could conceal a courier, a rival, or an observer, any entity capable of altering the balance of power he so meticulously maintained. Vigilance, he reminded himself, was not optional, it was the very currency of survival. And yet, the requirement for constant alertness imposed a personal toll, one that manifested as restlessness, occasional headaches, and the gnawing sense of solitude that defined so many nights. He wandered through corridors lined with portraits, photographs of family, allies, and events that marked his rise. The images celebrated power, triumph, and influence, yet each also carried a reminder of responsibility, vulnerability, and the transient nature of human relationships. Even those closest to him, the ones whose loyalty had been proven, were subject to uncertainty. People changed, circumstances shifted, intentions evolved. A king could command armies and territory, but he could not command human desire, fear, or ambition. As night deepened, Escobar's attention turned to the operational aspects of his empire. Reports arrived regarding shipments, movements, and minor conflicts. Each required analysis, decision-making, and, often, direct intervention. Even as he evaluated logistics, he remained aware of the personal costs. The solitude enforced by his lifestyle, the constant necessity to anticipate treachery, and the psychological strain of perpetual calculation. Every choice carried the weight of consequence, and every decision reinforced the boundaries of his self-imposed prison. He moved to a small, private courtyard, where fountains whispered and trees cast long, swaying shadows. The tranquility of the space was deceptive. The quiet magnified every thought, every concern, every flash of intuition that crossed his mind. This was a controlled environment, yet it offered no respite from the internal awareness of fragility. In the stillness, he felt the true nature of his power. Omnipotent in scope, yet perpetually constrained by uncertainty, paranoia, and the impossibility of absolute security. Escobar reflected on the paradox of his situation. He had created structures of security that could withstand external assault, yet none could shield him from the internal turbulence of doubt and awareness. He had surrounded himself with loyalty, yet each interaction was subject to evaluation. The very measures intended to ensure safety also reinforced isolation, transforming protection into confinement. His empire was expansive, but the most intricate fortresses were those built within his own mind. Hours passed in contemplation and observation. Guards maintained their positions, monitors glowed faintly, and the distant hum of Medellín provided a subtle, continuous backdrop. Escobar remained vigilant, moving methodically through the mansion, assessing, recalibrating, planning. The silent prison he inhabited was not merely physical. It was a cognitive, emotional, and strategic space, where isolation and responsibility intertwined to define his existence. By the early hours of morning, the mansion was still, save for faint noises of wind, animals, and distant traffic. Escobar paused at the balcony once more, surveying the estate and city beyond. He understood the nature of control. It was never complete, always provisional, and invariably burdened by the demands of vigilance. The empire he commanded was formidable, yet its preservation required unceasing attention, acute perception, and acceptance of the solitude that accompanied leadership at this scale. And so he remained there, observing, reflecting, calculating. The silent prison he had constructed around himself was not a punishment but a necessary condition of power, the coexistence of comfort and confinement, control and uncertainty, vigilance and isolation. In that quiet pre-dawn hour, Escobar accepted the paradox as he always did. A king both sovereign and solitary, powerful yet constrained, alive amid the structures he had built to preserve both himself and his domain. The night stretched deep and heavy over Medellín, the city's hum softened by distance and darkness. Pablo Escobar lay in the quiet of his private chamber, the faint moonlight filtering through the curtains, casting silver streaks across polished floors. The mansion was still, but the stillness brought no comfort. Sleep, when it came, was partial, fleeting, and always tainted with unrest. His mind, trained for vigilance, refused complete repose. Even in darkness, his thoughts were active, cataloging, predicting, and anticipating. At first, the night seemed calm, almost ordinary. His breathing slowed, his eyes closed, and the weight of the day pressed gently on his body. Then came the shift, the subtle transition between wakefulness and slumber where the boundary between perception and imagination thinned. Shadows began to move differently, sounds carried unfamiliar textures, and the rhythm of his heartbeat echoed in strange patterns. Escobar's subconscious wove a landscape at once familiar and alien, a city simultaneously Medellín and something distorted, a theater of both memory and fear. He found himself walking the streets of the city as if in a dream, yet each step was weighted with meaning. Alleyways stretched into improbable lengths, buildings shifted subtly when not directly observed, and distant shouts became indistinct whispers. The city was alive, and in it, threats emerged from every corner. Unseen assassins, disloyal lieutenants, rivals plotting silently, the faintest whisper of betrayal. Each encounter carried an intensity that felt amplified, magnified by the subconscious mind's heightened awareness. A familiar face emerged, a trusted lieutenant, but his features were distorted, his expression a strange blend of fear and malice. Escobar reached out, but the figure melted into shadow. He recognized the symbolism immediately. Loyalty, once assumed, was never absolute. Every ally carried the seed of potential betrayal. The realization brought no anger, only acute awareness. Dreams, he knew, distilled truth into metaphor, revealing fears and possibilities his waking mind could barely articulate. The landscape shifted again. Now he stood within his mansion, corridors extending endlessly, doors opening to rooms that should not exist. Guards moved with deliberate precision, but some wore masks of unfamiliar shapes, their faces obscured, their loyalty ambiguous. Each shadow was a puzzle, each reflection in polished floors an interrogation. Escobar's instincts guided him, yet even instincts were tested, for in dreams, logic bent and unfolded according to rules he could neither predict nor control. A sudden noise, a footstep in the hall, made his pulse quicken. He reached for a door handle only for it to vanish beneath his hand. Walls shifted, rooms seemed to multiply. The mansion, his sanctuary, had become a labyrinth, a manifestation of the cognitive maze he inhabited nightly. Each corridor reflected fears, insecurities, and the impossible demands of vigilance. He moved cautiously, every step deliberate, aware that miscalculation could carry consequences he could feel but not name. Memories intruded, overlapping with the distorted present. He recalled the faces of rivals struck down, friends betrayed, fleeting moments of joy with family, and opportunities seized or lost. Each memory was vibrant yet tinged with distortion. Laughter echoed with a hollow timbre, shadows of betrayal stretched across familiar halls, and the streets of Medellín shimmered with the duality of hope and danger. The unconscious mind distilled life into intense narrative, compressing decades of experience into sequences that felt immediate, urgent, and fraught with meaning. A vision emerged. A younger version of himself, standing in a modest home, dreaming of influence and wealth. The transformation to the present, to the empire, to the mansion, was abrupt, a stark reminder of the trajectory shaped by both ambition and circumstance. The dream highlighted contradictions: the innocence lost, the relationships strained, the price of power exacted in sleepless nights, constant vigilance, and the persistent weight of responsibility. He moved through the dreamscape with practiced caution. Shadows whispered threats, corridors shifted with intent, and each step required calculation. Trust remained conditional, alliances fragile, and even the familiar carried the possibility of betrayal. The landscape mirrored the empire itself: intricate, beautiful, perilous, and never fully controllable. Escobar understood that dreams were not mere illusions. They were reflections of reality, sharpened and intensified, revealing truths obscured by routine, repetition, and conscious denial. The night deepened further, blending slumber and consciousness. Escobar experienced scenarios that tested his strategic acumen, emotional resilience, and awareness. Couriers vanished into alleys, letters arrived with cryptic messages, allies shifted in demeanor, and the city's pulse synchronized with his own heartbeat. The dreamscape was both an exercise and a warning, training the mind to perceive threats, anticipate consequences, and reconcile contradictions. A figure appeared in the center of a courtyard, draped in shadow. Its identity was unclear, yet the presence demanded attention. Escobar approached cautiously, aware that confrontation was inevitable. The figure spoke without words, communicated through presence, gesture, and intention. The lesson was clear: power and vigilance are inseparable. Authority is never absolute. Control is a perpetual negotiation with uncertainty. By early morning, the dream began to dissolve. The mansion reformed, corridors shortened, shadows receded, and familiar sounds returned: the hum of distant traffic, the whisper of leaves, the faint rustle of animals. Escobar awoke partially, mind alert despite the fatigue of a night spent navigating subconscious threats. Sleep had offered no complete respite, but the dream had reinforced truths he already knew. Vigilance, perception, and strategic foresight were essential, and the boundaries between threat and security, fear and control, were perpetually fluid. Rising from the bed, he allowed a moment of stillness. The mansion was quiet, guards rested at their posts, the city began to stir. He reflected on the night's visions: the ever-present shadows of doubt, the potential for betrayal, the necessity of constant calculation. Dreams had condensed reality into intensified narrative, revealing the fragile interdependence of empire, family, loyalty, and self-preservation. As the first rays of dawn illuminated the estate, Escobar understood that his nights would always carry duality: a blend of memory and imagination, vigilance and fear, reality and reflection. Sleep was partial, imperfect, but the lessons extracted from the dreams were enduring. The price of power, he recognized once again, was perpetual awareness, not only in waking hours but even in the quiet, shadowed spaces of the mind. In the still pre-dawn moments, he walked to the balcony, breathing deeply, absorbing the subtle scents of flowers and earth, listening to the soft chorus of awakening life. He understood that, for a man who ruled an empire built on precision, vigilance, and influence, the mind itself could become both prison and guide. Dreams and nightmares were inseparable companions, offering insight and caution, revealing both weakness and strength. And so, as Medellín stirred beneath the soft light of morning, Pablo Escobar remained poised, attentive, and aware. A king who ruled by day, navigated shadows by night, and whose vigilance extended into the delicate and unpredictable realm of dreams, where the boundaries between threat and perception, power and vulnerability, were forever fluid. The morning light seeped through the curtains in soft, muted hues, casting long, delicate patterns across the floors of Pablo Escobar's hilltop mansion. The city of Medellín below pulsed with its usual rhythm: vendors calling in the streets, vehicles winding through narrow alleys, children's laughter mingling with the distant hum of engines. To anyone observing from below, the day appeared ordinary, unremarkable. Yet Escobar knew differently. He was acutely aware that beneath the veneer of routine currents of risk and opportunity swirled continuously, and the cost of maintaining his dominion had become an ever-present weight pressing upon him. He rose slowly, boots tapping softly against polished marble floors, moving through corridors lined with books, photographs, and relics of power. Each object was a reminder of achievement, yet also a symbol of responsibility, consequence, and the isolation inherent in his station. Even amidst luxury, the mansion felt like a carefully constructed cell, its walls both protective and confining. The empire he had built shielded him from many external threats, but it could not guard against the internal erosion wrought by perpetual vigilance and the subtle toll of distrust. As he moved through the private courtyard, the gardens shimmered under the morning sun. Birds flitted between flowering trees, fountains whispered softly, and the faint fragrance of blooming flowers carried through the air. For a brief moment, the serenity of the scene offered him a fleeting comfort. Yet even amidst beauty, the awareness of fragility lingered. Every leaf, every shadow, every sound was a potential signal, a reminder that the world beyond these walls could intrude unpredictably. The cost of his dominion was not just in sleepless nights or perpetual calculation, it was in the quiet burden of unrelenting awareness. Escobar walked to his study, maps and documents spread before him like a complex mosaic. Each route, each territory, each relationship was meticulously charted, yet the underlying truth remained. Control was provisional, loyalty conditional, and the human element always unpredictable. He traced lines connecting distant locations, analyzed recent reports, and anticipated potential conflicts. Decisions, however precise, carried consequences that rippled unpredictably through his empire. Mistakes were not merely errors, they were opportunities for rivals to exploit, allies to falter, and his own security to be compromised. The solitude of this process pressed upon him, reminding him that isolation was the inevitable companion of leadership at his scale. Even surrounded by loyal men, armed guards, and devoted staff, the ultimate responsibility rested solely on his shoulders. Every mistake was his, every success contingent on his judgment, and every unforeseen disruption a reflection of the limits of his control. The weight of an empire was both tangible and invisible, a continuous strain on mind, body, and spirit. Later in the morning, Escobar convened a meeting with several trusted lieutenants. The discussion was ostensibly practical: territory disputes, shipment logistics, potential threats, but beneath it lay a constant negotiation of trust. Subtle cues, hesitations, and micro-expressions spoke volumes. One lieutenant's voice was measured, almost cautious. Another's eyes flicked occasionally, betraying a thought unspoken. Each interaction was a reminder that even among the most reliable men, loyalty could waver, and ambition could subtly undermine stability. As the meeting concluded, Escobar retreated to the balcony, absorbing the panorama of the city below. Medellín shimmered with life and danger intertwined, a complex tapestry in which he was both orchestrator and observer. He reflected on the paradox of power: the greater his influence, the more dependent he became on others' actions, and the more acute his awareness of the consequences of miscalculation. Even in control, he was bound by uncertainty, constrained by human unpredictability, and constantly reminded of the fragility inherent in authority. By afternoon, the mansion was alive with movement. Servants attended to mundane tasks, guards patrolled methodically, and the subtle sounds of daily routine created an atmosphere of controlled order. Yet Escobar could not fully participate in this rhythm. He remained attuned to every deviation, every anomaly, every subtle disruption that might signal a threat or an opportunity. Vigilance was constant, and the effort exacted a toll: fatigue, tension, and a pervasive sense of isolation. The more he watched, the more he realized how inescapable the shadows of responsibility had become. In the library, he reviewed historical accounts of rulers who had conquered, maintained power, and ultimately faltered. Patterns emerged: the cost of vigilance, the consequences of misplaced trust, the isolation imposed by authority. Escobar understood that he was living these lessons in real time. The wealth, influence, and security he commanded were tangible and formidable, yet they could not shield him from the subtle erosion of peace, the unceasing mental exertion required to anticipate threats, and the emotional weight of leadership. As evening approached, the mansion settled into a quieter rhythm. Shadows lengthened, fountains reflected the fading light, and the air carried a subtle coolness. Escobar walked the corridors slowly, reflecting on the psychological toll of empire. Sleep remained elusive, a luxury denied by the perpetual need for vigilance. Even brief lapses could imperil his family, his allies, or the delicate balance of his operations. Authority, he recognized, was inseparable from responsibility, and responsibility demanded attention that was unyielding and often exhausting. He paused on the balcony as night fell fully. The city shimmered faintly in the distance, a network of lives, ambitions, and potential disruptions. Escobar reflected on the cost of his existence. The solitude, the perpetual awareness, the constant calculation, and the psychological strain of managing both empire and family. Even surrounded by wealth and loyalty, he remained acutely conscious of vulnerability, the fragility of human relationships, the impermanence of security, and the unpredictable nature of circumstance. The mansion was quiet except for the subtle whispers of wind through trees and the gentle trickle of fountains. Escobar inhaled deeply, allowing the cool night air to fill his lungs. In this solitude, he contemplated the cumulative burden of his power, the unrelenting need for vigilance, the emotional weight of responsibility, and the awareness that control was always provisional. The empire was vast, formidable, and influential, but it exacted a personal toll that wealth, influence, or loyalty could not fully mitigate. In the deep hours before dawn, Escobar stood on the balcony, surveying both the mansion and the city. The shadows of the night seemed to stretch endlessly, reflecting the paradox of his life. A man who commanded immeasurable power, yet was constrained by vigilance. A man surrounded by loyalty, yet isolated by the weight of decision. A king whose influence could shape the city, yet whose own rest remained fragile and incomplete. The cost of shadows, he understood, was perpetual. The blending of authority and isolation, control and uncertainty, vigilance and solitude. It was a burden borne not by external enemies, but by the demands of leadership, the complexities of human loyalty, and the relentless awareness of impermanence. And as the first hints of dawn tinged the horizon, Escobar accepted this truth, that the life of a king, no matter how powerful, was inseparable from the shadows it cast, and the toll they exacted on mind, body, and spirit. The first light of dawn crept over Medellín, spilling soft amber across the hills and valleys. The city, alive in cycles of movement, commerce, and quiet ambition, seemed almost unaware of the figure observing it from his hilltop mansion. Pablo Escobar stood on the balcony, the gentle breeze carrying the scent of wet earth and blooming flowers, and for a rare moment, he allowed himself to simply breathe. The mansion was quiet. Servants moved with practiced care, guards maintained their positions, and the distant hum of the city blended with the subtle whisper of fountains and the rustle of leaves. Escobar's empire, vast and complex, stretched far beyond these walls, yet here in the soft pre-dawn light, the enormity of it felt suspended. The weight of vigilance, of responsibility, and of power seemed to ease just slightly, as though the world had granted a brief reprieve. He turned his gaze inward, reflecting on the nights of unease, the dreams and nightmares, the silent corridors of solitude that had defined so much of his existence. Each challenge, each decision, each shadowed threat had shaped him, honed him, and left an indelible mark on his psyche. The cost of control had been steep. Sleepless nights, constant calculation, isolation, and the persistent hum of paranoia. Yet these burdens had also imparted clarity, resilience, and a keen understanding of the delicate interplay between authority and vulnerability. Escobar walked slowly through the mansion's corridors, his footsteps muted against the polished floors. Light spilled through the windows, illuminating familiar objects. Bookshelves lined with volumes of history and strategy, photographs capturing moments of family and loyalty, artifacts collected from a life of triumph and danger. Each object was a reminder of the duality he lived. Power intertwined with responsibility, wealth entwined with vigilance, influence inseparable from isolation. He paused in the library, letting his fingers trace the spines of books that had offered guidance, wisdom, and, at times, comfort. The stories of rulers, conquerors, and men who had navigated ambition and betrayal provided perspective. Lessons were clear. Vigilance was essential, loyalty was fragile, and even the most formidable empire could be threatened by misjudgment or oversight. Escobar absorbed these truths, letting them settle in the quiet morning air. In the gardens, birds stirred, fountains whispered, and the first rays of sun glimmered on dew-kissed flowers. Escobar moved among them, observing, noting, reflecting. The world was alive in its small, intricate patterns. A leaf trembling in the wind, a cat slipping silently along the stone path, a servant pausing in their routine. Each movement was ordinary, yet to him, it was a reminder of life's persistent rhythms and the subtle balance between control and unpredictability. He returned to the balcony, gazing across Medellín, the city stretching in every direction. The streets, the rooftops, the distant mountains, all formed a tapestry of order, chaos, ambition, and everyday life. Escobar understood that his role in this tapestry was both prominent and paradoxical. A man capable of commanding immense influence, yet subject to the constant imperfection of human behavior and the inevitability of uncertainty. Even kings were bound by the consequences of choices made, trust extended, and vigilance exercised. The quiet allowed him a rare moment of introspection. He thought of his family, the children whose laughter had once filled corridors and gardens, the loyal lieutenants who had served faithfully, and the fragile threads of loyalty that sustained his empire. Power had been won through strategy, risk, and determination. It had been maintained through observation, subtle correction, and the constant navigation of ambition and fear. Yet the human cost was undeniable: solitude, vigilance, and the perpetual awareness that control was never absolute. Night had left traces in his mind: the ghosts of missteps, the shadows of potential betrayal, the lingering resonance of decisions that might ripple unpredictably through lives, fortunes, and relationships. He reflected on these burdens, allowing acknowledgement rather than judgment. They were part of the cost, inseparable from the privilege of authority, a shadow always present even in moments of calm. The mansion's corridors were quiet now, the city beneath gradually awakening to routine. Escobar moved toward a small inner courtyard, where fountains whispered and the scent of flowers mingled with the cool morning air. He lingered, absorbing the serenity, the subtle patterns of life that persisted despite chaos, and the knowledge that his influence, though vast, existed within a world that was fundamentally unpredictable. He took a deep, deliberate breath, feeling the tension in his chest ease fractionally. The world for a moment seemed to pause. Shadows and light danced across the walls, the soft murmur of the city and estate blending into a lullaby of awareness and reflection. Even the most powerful man could find solace in observation, in understanding, in the acceptance of life's inherent paradoxes. Escobar considered the arc of his life: ambition and influence, vigilance and sacrifice, moments of tenderness and instances of ruthless calculation. The empire he had built, the relationships he had forged, the legacy he had shaped, all were reflections of both his mastery and his vulnerability. And within this recognition lay a subtle comfort. Understanding the cost of power allowed him to navigate it more wisely, to anticipate its shadows, and to find moments of clarity amid the complexities of command. As the sun fully rose, bathing Medellín in golden light, Escobar allowed himself to rest his gaze, to linger in stillness. The empire, the city, the mansion, all remained, and he remained, attentive yet momentarily unburdened by the immediate demands of decision. The quiet was fragile but present, a fleeting respite in the continuum of vigilance that defined his life. For a king, the night always demanded attention, the day required action, and the mind never fully rested. Yet in this rare morning calm, Escobar found a measure of peace, a moment to observe, to reflect, and to drift gently into the awareness that control, vigilance, and responsibility, though permanent companions, could coexist with brief intervals of stillness, clarity, and understanding. And so, as Medellín awakened beneath the soft glow of morning, Pablo Escobar, king and prisoner of his own empire, remained poised in reflection, fully conscious of the paradox of power, fully aware of the shadows that accompanied it, and for this brief moment, allowed himself to drift into the quiet.